The other pro I would say is that it just lowers the barrier to entry, right? I think if you go through this process, usually the interview process is faster, it's less rigorous.
Hey, my name is Felix Tia. I'm the host of the Culture of Code. We invite experienced and successful tech industry leaders like software engineers, engineering managers, and product managers to reveal exactly what they've learned about growing and succeeding in the tech industry. In today's episode, we have Carlos Rymer, Senior Engineering Manager at LinkedIn. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you.
So your background is pretty unique. I think you came from interesting stuff you studied to get before coming into tech. You specialize in environmental science and sustainability. So tell us more about what sparked your interest in software engineering and what that transition was like.
Yeah, that's a question I get quite often from people who perhaps are entering tech from a non-traditional background or are exploring entering tech. They primarily studied a different discipline in college, just like myself. The way I actually learned about software engineering was through a class in college. So one thing I did when I was in college, I had the opportunity to attend a college with a wide breadth of college course offerings and a wide range of disciplines. And so I wanted to take the opportunity to just expand my breadth, right, of knowledge and understanding of the world. So I aspired to take one course in a different discipline at least every other semester. So I took courses in botany, I took courses in hospitality, and one course that I took was around entrepreneurship. This specific course involved me working with a few other students to come up with a business plan, essentially. And at the end of the semester, we would pitch the idea that we had to a number of investors with the goal of potentially getting some seed money to go after our idea. It was a time when Twitter and Facebook were just kind of going really viral, especially on college campuses. And this idea of Web 2.0 was becoming a very hot topic. And my team decided that, hey, let's try something around web, right? We had an idea to create a Web 2.0 based enterprise and pitch that to the investors. Unfortunately, none of us had a software engineering background. We had folks from the hospitality school. I was from science school, but not with an engineering focus. And we had others from other disciplines. So we had to basically, roll up our sleeves and try to learn how we would actually build a demo for the idea that we had. So that's what introduced me into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as kind of like the first building blocks that I was able to leverage to put together at least a demo. That sparked my interest because I was able to, on the one hand, learn very quickly, and on the other hand, be able to see like the impact that this could have, right? So like me being able to put out an experience that was similar to a lot of other experiences I saw on the web just wowed me. And it sparked an interest. After that, I just wanted to learn even more. And so I decided to work on my own projects. I had lots of ideas at the time. Also, I was a campus organizer for the climate change movement. And so I had a lot of ideas of how I could leverage these skills to help with my campus organizing. That was what sparked my interest. And, after that, it became a secondary passion for me.
Yeah, I think it's always helpful when you are learning about software engineering, when you're just kind of scratching your own itch or trying to solve something that's your own problem. I think a lot of people get stuck in what they call tutorial hell, where they don't have like an objective that they are passionate or that they care about themselves, which kind of going through the motions of doing the tutorial. But having a problem that you're trying to solve yourself kind of requires you to actually learn and apply what you're learning. So I think that's a great path into it. For someone that's in college that is at a college, let's say, that is offering software engineering courses or intro classes that you can take as electives, or that's not a part of your like typical, I guess, curriculum for your degree, but they're worried that, am I going to be ready for it? Will I fall behind? Am I technical enough? Am I going to be graded or in a class with people that have been building software since they were like 5 years old? Are those concerns valid? Like, what are your thoughts on like if someone has that concern but has the opportunity to also take these kind of courses?
It's always a valid concern. I think part of it is also what we hear in the media, like what we learn based on what we see on both kind of digital media, so traditional publishing, as well as social media, where a lot of the focus is on the companies that make the news, right? It's the Amazons and the Googles and so on, the Apples and so on and so forth. And so I think oftentimes, because we hear about the opportunities that these companies offer, we always think that that's what we need to aspire for. But the reality is that there's such a wide spectrum of software engineering opportunities out there. And I think, at least for me, what was important was to get experience, get a foot in and get experience, and not get too held up in whether, I'm at a place where that's being talked about in the news all the time. But it's still a valid concern, because oftentimes, like, what, when you, let's say, graduate from college and you're aspiring to enter the tech field, you're immediately going to think about these top companies. But what I always recommend people to think about is that their careers is a journey. Your career is a journey. You can start somewhere and you could always aspire to go where you want. And so don't get too held up on a short list of places where you think you might find opportunities, and just go wide. Just be very open. Just try to get experience. Any opportunity you get, you're going to learn a ton. You're going to be able to go deeper and apply what you learn in college. And if you are if you have if you're studying computer science specifically, you will have opportunities to go after internships, right? And so that's something that you can definitely aspire to do while you're in college. That'll giving exposure. It'll help you prepare to apply what you're learning, through your studies. But, have an open mind. Just remember that there's a really wide spectrum. Like, almost every industry out there is in need of people with software engineering skills. So it's not just the large tech companies. You can find opportunities in finance, in media, in farming, in insurance, like, you name it. You can find opportunities in almost every sector. So just don't get held up on that.
Yeah, I think that that's important, that you're not going to come out of college and, I mean, some people do, but not everyone just lands at like their dream job right off the bat. I think most people don't land at their dream job right off the bat. And we should talk about your progression, because now we mentioned that you worked at LinkedIn, which is a big, well-known company on its own right, but also owned by Microsoft, which everyone knows about Microsoft. And then your Amazon and Shopify in the past, which are kind of brand names, but you didn't start off at these kind of brand names. You started off, I think your first job or gig out of school was writing software for a much smaller company. So tell us about getting that first job, especially when I don't think correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't graduate with like a CS degree or like a CS minor or anything like that, but you're still able to get that first job and kind of progress from there. Tell us about getting that first job, which I think all people are always concerned about, and always the hardest job to get in, to break into the tech space.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that I didn't have a computer science background at all, either as a minor or as a major. I went to grad school and graduated in 2009 in the middle of the financial meltdown. And at that time, I still wanted to get a job in something related to sustainability. Most of the jobs were in DC or in California. I was in the New York area, and I didn't really want to leave because I had family close. I just wanted to stay close to family. So I was still pursuing this secondary passion, and I stumbled upon an opportunity. I was all the projects I was working on, I would actually publish them. That's how I think I was able to land this first opportunity, where it was someone in upstate New York who had a small e-commerce operation and was in need of some help to develop certain features and so on. So it was a consulting type of job, a company probably that, if I mentioned it, nobody wouldn't really know much about, but it was still a great learning opportunity. It was built on a PHP sort of platform called Egg. I don't know if it's too well known anymore, but back in the days, it was kind of like a Drupal. It was kind of an alternative. And so I learned a ton it was my first introduction to PHP, and it just allowed me to go a little bit deeper. And then after that, a few months into that role, I started to actually get like recruiting agencies reaching out to me saying, "Hey, we're interested in the work you did, that you're doing now, and that you've done through your projects. We have a few opportunities that we would like to put you in front of." And one of those opportunities was with Univision, which is a media company. I believe they're headquartered in New York, but their main studios are in Miami. But they cater to the Latino community, both in the US and in Latin America. They're a really well-known company for the Latino community because they draw the largest Latino audience of any media company in the US. And so they're super well known. And when I heard about that opportunity, I was like, yeah, absolutely. I want to try it. And it ended up becoming a something, right? I was hired as initially as a contractor for 3 months, then became a full-time 3 months later as a web developer. And that was like my first full-time opportunity back then. But yeah, I didn't, it all kind of just happened. I didn't even plan it. I was just looking to do something while I was still searching for jobs because I had to start repaying my college debt. And I was like, let me see if this can work out so I can at least start paying my college debt while I get something that I'm interested in and I would like, and it's near where I live. But 3 years later after that, I was like, there's no turning back. This is now what I do.
Yeah, I think that must have been a relief knowing landing that transitioning from that kind of contract role into like a full-time job. I think it's like a almost a stamp of like validation that, oh, I'm actually a software engineer. Like, I mean, you're still one when you're doing contract work, but there's something about like crossing that chasm where it's like, okay, now things are becoming more real to some degree. I kind of went through the similar experience where I was, self-taught, and getting that first job just kind of validates all the effort that you put into it. And I think one of the difficulties with the approach that you've taken, or anyone that's taken that hasn't graduated with a traditional like CS degree, is that you're leaving school with usually without the internships that are relevant to getting like a software engineering job. And one of the most viable options is the path that you took, which was to get this contract and freelance work to build some kind of portfolio, build some kind of track record that people are willing to pay you for the work that you're doing. But what would you say, looking back on that time, what would you say are kind of like the pros and cons with this approach? I mean, maybe you'd have many options anyway, but like, what were the pros and cons as you were going through it?
Well, for me, the obvious pro was like, it was a good solution, right? While I was still trying to get a foot into the sustainability field. So that was a more of a personal pro. But I think the other pro I would say is that it just lowers the barrier to entry, right? I think if you go through this process, usually the interview process is faster, it's less rigorous. Usually if it's some type of consulting or contracting role, they're looking for people to do some specific part of a full role. In this case, it was doing just front end development. So just mostly someone was going to give me some mock-ups. I was just going to actually build the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for it, hand it over to someone else. They're not looking for me to actually integrate it with whatever system they might have that actually brings about the experience. They were looking for me to do just like a specific thing. And so because of that, the barrier to entry, was so much lower than if I was actually assessed as someone who was going to do a lot more than that. Once you're in, you're able to do more, right? You're able to demonstrate more. You're able to show more value, and so through that, you can then I think cross that bridge to a full-time role, so to say. And so that's one of the biggest pros I see. The con, of course, is that from a pay perspective, you probably are going to be paid less than what you would if you were to enter as a full-time employee. Probably right out of the gate, you're going to be limited in terms of like what projects you might be able to work on. You're still going to learn, but like in my case, I was asked to do like some specific things. It wasn't like go in and actually build this into our content management system platform and make it live. So the responsibilities were more limited. So that's definitely a con. But depending on where you are in and the path that you take, if you do come from a non-CS background, it's a perfect way in, right? It's a perfect way to learn. It's a great way to get a lot of exposure that otherwise you wouldn't get.
Yeah, and I think when I was looking for my first jobs too, I think whenever I'm not sure if your job listing said this, but a lot of them would say things like contract with the potential for full time. And I remember always being suspicious about this kind of potentially over promising that maybe they're trying to sell me on this so that I come in, but then I don't actually there's actually no budget to bring me on full time. Did you have any, I guess, concerns about that? And like, did you do anything to particularly help guarantee that you would eventually become a full time employee? With your experience at Univision?
I didn't. And this was like 14 years ago, 10, 13, 14 years ago. So at that time, I think the sort of not necessarily the knowledge, but the experience or the availability of information about how to go about landing a role in tech wasn't the same than it is now. And so as a result of that, I didn't do any planning. I didn't do any research. I just kind of like took that opportunity and went for it. Today, I think there's a lot more information and, you can learn about how can you negotiate, right? You don't always necessarily have to take like the first offer. You can say, hey, what about if we structure it this way or that way? You try to see how you can make sure that the agreement can benefit you the most. But back in 2009, 2010, that type of information was just not available as readily, perhaps. And so I just kind of went for it. I had no concerns. I just thought of it as like, hey, this is Univision. It's a well-known brand in the Latino community. And I think this is going to be a good opportunity for me. Let me just go for it. And when I get in, let me do my best, right? To see what happens. And yeah. And then, a few months later, turned out, I was told like, hey, we're converting you to full time.
That's awesome.
But I didn't plan for it.
Yeah.
I think today the benefit that many people have is that you can plan for it more intentionally.
Yeah, and also to some degree, almost as I guess a counterpoint to that is that a lot of it's sometimes out of your control. You might be trying your best, and there's just no budget for, or just there's nothing you can do. But all you can really focus on is like what's your effort that you can put into it, and hopefully it pans out. And hopefully you have at least you're walking away with another thing on your resume, and maybe hopefully a more to your portfolio, more things you can speak to during interviews, and kind of go into it with that kind of expectation. I think can be helpful.
And you're going to
Yeah,
learn too, right?
sure.
Like you're going to learn a ton.
Yeah, and speaking of learning, I think one thing when you mentioned this earlier about how when you're kind of brought in as a contractor, you're usually brought in to like work on a specifically scoped project, and you're kind of here to execute, and maybe there's they hire different people for different things, but typically that's the way that I've seen like contractors brought in. How do you kind of transition out of this, I don't know, this approach towards software engineering where you're here to execute into more of the typically more seen as a senior engineer kind of responsibilities where you're doing more of the planning and designing and scoping, which I typically I don't think are given as responsibilities to contractors.
Right. That's usually true. As you said, you have very specific scope and that's what you're asked to do. But I think most of the time, nobody's going to say no if you go outside of that scope. Nobody's going to say, oh, there's something broken here. Nobody can fix it right now. Neither can you because this is your scope. Nobody's going to deny you that opportunity. So I think what I did actually is that I looked for opportunities. I looked for gaps. I tried to understand from people I was working with, like what are some of the challenges you're facing? What are some of the pain points? What are the things that you're not able to do? Let me see how I can help you. So oftentimes it was really trying to go above and beyond. It was trying to see how else could I be helpful. And so, for example, early on in that role at Innovision, we had no performance monitoring on our pages. So we were building and redesigning all these websites across different localities for Univision. They had a number of radio stations and their primary kind of local TV channels. But we had no idea about, how those pages were performing. And as a result, we didn't know what the opportunity was to, drive even more engagement. We all know how important it is, like that, page loads within a certain time frame, and you have the ability to interact within a certain time frame. That's so important to making people stay. So I saw that as an opportunity. Like my manager had said, "Hey, it'd be great if we could do this." And I said, "Oh, let me own it. Let me do it." And I started to research like what tools are available to do this type of performance monitoring. I found one. I worked with someone who was responsible for kind of like just vendor contracting and so on. And we were able to get a plan, and I started to use the tool and create reports. And I was like, here's a report, like here's how uh the our pages are doing from a performance standpoint, just using like, page load as a metric, page load time as a metric. And he was just like, oh wow, this is awesome. I want you to work on producing like a more comprehensive report, and I'm going to send it to the CEO of the digital division every month so that he sees like how our pages are doing, and then we can report back on overall trend as we like take certain measures to improve page load time. And so opportunities like that are always going to be available. Every company has problems, more problems than they can resolve, they can take on. And so it's about looking for those, and then, finding a way to own them if you can.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's like a muscle that you have to exercise. It's something that I want to get better at too. This ability to identify not only opportunities, but like which ones are the worthwhile ones, which ones should be like the top priority ones that you go after, and then the whole process of kind of getting the buy-in and actually carrying through the entire idea to like execution. Do you have any advice on that, on like how to identify? I think you kind of spoke to this about you spoke to internal folks about like what kind of problems that they have, what kind of difficulties they have. That's a great way, I think, to find these opportunities. Any other kind of sources that you look to or that you looked to find opportunities? And then also, how did you identify which ones are worthwhile to actually pursue?
Yeah. So back then it was just like my matters said, hey, this is something I've always wanted to tackle. And so that was my only data point. Today, fast forward over a decade, of course, like I think I'm a bit more methodical about it. So I do want to think, what is the actual impact that an opportunity might have, and impact you can quantify in a number of ways. How much productivity is this going to unlock for employees, or how much more revenue is this possibly going to drive? How much is it going to able to save the business, and so on. So you can look at like a number of metrics to try to understand impact. The other variable that you can weigh is also like how critical this is to a wide audience within the space that you're operating. If you're hearing this being a problem from a lot of people, it's obviously like a pain point, right? That a lot of people are just feeling. Either it's creating friction, or it's just a nuisance for a lot of people. That's also a good input. It doesn't always have to be something that you necessarily need to quantify, but if you hear it from a lot of people, you see that there's some commonality about this problem, and that might be a way that you can, get a sense that it's important to solve. Yet another one is sort of sometimes there are a lot of things that are intangible that maybe it's not super important to people, but it's grounded in the values that you and the company may have. So accessibility is one that, I can think of, where it's sometimes hard to quantify what the impact is. You know that by building more accessible experiences, you you are expanding your reach, but it's sometimes hard to quantify. But also you may value making your experiences accessible to everyone, right? This is something that you as a company just aspire to make sure that you're doing that, you're doing good for everyone. And if you can try to justify it that way, then that's also another way that you can assess whether it's something worth solving.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point about how you can. It depends on the company, and the different values that the company have is going to vary depending on where you're at and what it should be the kind of filter that you can use to determine whether you should be working on something or not, or how easy is it going to be to get other people to agree for you to, spend your time on it? I want to kind of leave you this last question. I think it's a important decision that you had made at one point where maybe others are thinking about too, about changing jobs. And when you were at Amazon first and then eventually shifted over or changed jobs to Shopify, and it was a big decision for you because you were at Amazon for a little bit over 2.5 years and had like a promotion opportunity at Amazon, but made the transition anyway. Tell us about what went into your thought process for that decision.
Yeah, I think at that point, I was over a decade into, or about a decade into my career, and I was starting to value a few other things. I was starting to think about building a family and and so on. So one of the factors was definitely I was looking for an opportunity where I could have some more work-life balance. That was definitely one key factor. The other factor was this opportunity presented itself, and it was interesting because I was looking for work-life balance, but I'm always up for a new challenge and a challenge that will enable me to learn and grow. So that was actually the other aspect, that this was kind of part of the same overall domain I was in, but a bit divergent from like what I was doing. I was in the big data space, building insights, and this was an opportunity to work closely on a paid marketing program. So it was I knew it would mean a lot of learning, and it was also expanded scope from what I had in the previous role. So those two factors weighed in, and I think at the end I was able to be convinced that I was still going to have the opportunity to like have this new challenge, but I was going to also be able to attain more flexibility in terms of work life balance, and that's what made me make that decision. 10 years ago, before that decision, I probably wouldn't have cared about work life balance because I was much younger and I wasn't married at the time, and so on and so forth. But depending on where you are in your own life journey, things may change. You may start to value certain aspects that previously you may not have valued, and so that became a reality as part of that decision. It was like at a point in my time where I was just looking for something different, and that's what resulted in that decision.
Yeah, and this is a opens a whole can of worms, but I think a lot of companies can. I think what they a lot of times they suffer from is that there are people like you that are top talents that are doing great at their job, but you value different things than what the company is maybe focused on offering, and it's a shame that a lot of people have to leave to go to different jobs, not only for the company but then also the whole process of getting a new job, just specifically because they're missing this kind of key aspect that you're looking for now in your stage of life. So yeah, I guess the point is that it's a deeply personal question about like why you decide to leave, but appreciate you sharing that as a very valid reason that I think is for someone to change jobs. So thank you so much for your time, Carlos Rymer, Senior Engineering Manager at LinkedIn. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your journey and experience and advice with us.
Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.